He had always been a man who knew how to take charge. People around him often looked at him with admiration, not knowing that behind the smile and friendly words, there was a part of him that enjoyed the feeling of control. He started small, gaining trust from his colleagues and the people in the community center where he worked. At first, his leadership seemed natural, even inspiring. He would organize events, manage projects, and help people find their roles. Everyone thought he had the best intentions, and that made it easier for him to slip into the habits that would later cause trouble. In the beginning, his power seemed harmless. He would make small decisions without consulting others, convincing himself that he was acting in the best interest of everyone. When he assigned tasks, he often gave the easier or more rewarding ones to people he liked, while overloading others. At first, the team didn't notice. They were grateful for his guidance and trusted that he knew what he was doing. But slowly, the unfairness began to grow. Those who were overworked or ignored started feeling frustrated, but they didn't speak up. They worried about consequences or thought it wasn't their place to question him. He loved the attention he received for his achievements. Every time an event went smoothly or a project was completed on time, he would take credit, sometimes forgetting to acknowledge the hard work of others. People began to notice, and some whispered among themselves, but fear kept them from saying anything directly. It was not that he was cruel yet. He was clever and charming. He had a way of making people feel valued while quietly taking more than he gave. His charm made it hard to see the problem clearly. One day, a new team member joined the center. She was energetic and full of ideas. She noticed things that others had ignored. She saw how he would subtly influence decisions in his favor, and how some voices were always left unheard. Unlike others, she was not afraid to speak her mind. She asked questions, suggested alternative approaches, and sometimes pointed out inconsistencies in his behavior. At first, he smiled and nodded, pretending to appreciate her input. But inside, he felt a spark of irritation. He wasn't used to being challenged. Despite the irritation, he did not act openly against her. Instead, he became more calculated. He would offer her praise in front of others while quietly undermining her ideas when he could. It was subtle, and many people didn't notice. He had learned that power was not just about control. It was about perception. As long as people thought he was fair and capable, they would follow him blindly. And that gave him the freedom to bend rules and manipulate situations to his advantage. Meanwhile, life at the community center continued. People came for support, to attend events, and to learn new skills. Most of them respected the man because he appeared organized and reliable. He had a talent for making people feel that he was always working for their good. He would listen to complaints, nod sympathetically, and promise changes. Often nothing would actually change, but the promise was enough to keep people quiet. It was a game he had perfected over the years. His influence extended beyond the center. He was invited to meetings, community gatherings, and small public events. Everywhere he went, he presented a confident, kind image. To outsiders, he was the person who could solve problems and make things happen. But behind closed doors, his decisions were often self-serving. He favored friends and punished those he disliked. It was never overt, just enough to tilt situations in his favor. His control grew, and so did his enjoyment of it. One afternoon, he called a team meeting. Everyone expected it to be a routine update, but he had something different in mind. He spoke about his vision for the future, emphasizing his own role and subtly reminding everyone of their dependence on him. Some people felt proud to be part of his plan, while others felt uneasy. The new team member noticed the tension and exchanged glances with colleagues. They all sensed that something was off, but the man's charm and authority made it difficult to confront the issue directly. He began to test the limits of his power. He made decisions that bypassed usual procedures, justifying them as necessary for efficiency. If someone questioned him, he would smile and explain patiently, but in a way that made it clear their opinions were secondary. It was the first real sign that his power was no longer harmless. It had become a tool for control, used carefully to maintain appearances while advancing his own interests. Life for those under his influence became complicated. They wanted to speak up but feared retaliation. They wanted fairness but were unsure how to achieve it without disrupting their own lives. The new team member tried to rally support, but most people had grown accustomed to staying quiet. Fear and habit had created a subtle but firm barrier. Meanwhile, he continued to navigate these dynamics effortlessly, always one step ahead. Despite the growing imbalance, There were moments when he acted kindly and sincerely. He helped someone in need, recognized a team member's hard work, or solved a difficult problem. These moments confused people, making it harder to see the full picture of his behavior. It was a mix of generosity and control, and it kept people hopeful that he was ultimately good. But the truth was slowly becoming clearer. His power was being misused, even if only a few could see it. As months went by, small cracks began to appear. Whispers of frustration spread quietly through the center. People who had once admired him started feeling drained and overlooked. The new team member kept documenting examples, quietly gathering evidence of his unfair practices. She knew confrontation would be difficult without support. She also knew that his charm and influence made it unlikely that anyone would act without a clear plan. Still, she was determined not to ignore what was happening. One particular incident marked a turning point. A project had gone wrong not because of anyone's incompetence, but because of his interference. He had made last-minute changes, ignored input from key team members, and forced a solution that served his image rather than the community's needs. The result was chaos. People were frustrated, embarrassed, and demoralized. It was the first time his mismanagement could not be easily brushed aside. His reputation remained mostly intact, but the cracks were visible to those paying attention. The man sensed the change. He felt that his control was slipping, but he did not panic. He believed his charisma and previous successes would protect him. He continued to charm outsiders, show kindness selectively, and maintain his public image. However, internally he became more cautious. He studied those who might oppose him, looking for weaknesses or distractions to keep his position secure. His misused power had reached a level where subtle manipulation was now a daily habit. Meanwhile, the community center itself was still functioning, but morale was low. Some people began avoiding meetings. Others did just the minimum work, and a few quietly searched for ways to report problems externally. The new team member remained the most proactive, encouraging others to notice the unfairness and reminding them that their voices mattered. She could see that change would not happen overnight, but small seeds were being planted. Through all of this, the man never lost his confidence in public. He continued to smile, speak kindly, and take credit for achievements. To many, he remained a respected leader. To a few, he was a figure of concern, a person whose charm hid a growing misuse of power. These contrasting perceptions created tension that was invisible to outsiders, but felt deeply by those involved. By the end of the first year, the situation had solidified. He had gained more authority, built a loyal circle of supporters, and maintained a positive public image. Yet the subtle misuse of power was taking a toll on the organization and its people. The new team member, though still cautious, had begun to quietly gather allies. She believed that if change were to come, it would need careful planning, courage, and perhaps unexpected help. She did not yet know how it would happen, but she felt strongly that standing by quietly was no longer an option. And so, the stage was set. The man continued his work, confident and unchallenged, while small movements of resistance and awareness began to form quietly around him. His misuse of power had not yet reached its peak, but the foundations of exposure were being laid. The contrast between his public image and private actions created tension that would eventually demand attention. People's patience, awareness, and courage were quietly growing, even as he continued to enjoy the benefits of unchecked authority. The story of what would happen next was only beginning, and the first cracks had already appeared in the carefully maintained facade. The misuse of power that had started quietly was beginning to show more clearly now. The man's small manipulations had grown into patterns that were difficult to ignore. People who had once admired him now felt a mix of fear and frustration. They wanted to speak up, but the thought of consequences held them back. He had learned to read their hesitation and used it to continue bending situations in his favor. He did not act cruelly, not in an obvious way, but his choices always gave himself an advantage and others a burden. The team at the community center began noticing that he was no longer simply managing projects, he was controlling outcomes. Decisions that used to be collective were now made by him alone. He justified it by saying that efficiency required fewer discussions. He would explain to others that his choices were based on experience, on knowing what was best, and most people believed him. Only a few had begun to question his methods, but their voices were quiet and cautious. The new team member remained observant, noting each incident, understanding that if this behavior continued unchecked, it could harm both the people and the organization. One of the first signs of real trouble came during a fundraising event. He had taken charge of the planning, dismissing some suggestions from the team in favor of his own ideas. At first, everything seemed fine. Guests arrived, tables were set, and activities ran smoothly. But when it came time to recognize contributors, he ignored the efforts of several key volunteers. People were left feeling overlooked and unappreciated. The new team member quietly approached those who were upset and offered support, explaining that recognition and fairness were important, and that their feelings were valid. Behind the scenes, he was careful not to create obvious enemies. He praised certain people publicly to maintain loyalty, while quietly undermining others who spoke up. The tactics were subtle, but effective. Some colleagues began to notice the pattern but found it difficult to point it out without evidence. They remembered the charm he showed in public and the way he seemed fair at meetings. This contrast made it hard to rally support against him, and many preferred to keep their heads down, hoping the issues would resolve themselves. Despite the growing unease, he maintained a friendly facade. He smiled, helped people when needed, and appeared committed to the community. But his actions were increasingly self-serving. He would assign tasks to people who were already overburdened while giving lighter, more enjoyable responsibilities to those who would support him. He monitored interactions carefully, making mental notes of who could be influenced and who might resist. His power was becoming less about managing and more about controlling. The new team member tried to raise concerns gently. She approached him with suggestions, questions, and evidence of unfair practices, hoping to appeal to his better nature. At first he listened and nodded, giving the impression of consideration, but internally he felt annoyed that someone was questioning his methods. He did not act openly against her, but he began to manipulate situations more carefully, testing the limits of what he could do without triggering direct confrontation. Outside of the center, the man's reputation remained strong. He attended community events, made speeches, and was praised for his leadership. People outside the organization continued to see him as competent and kind, unaware of the tension inside. This contrast created a complex environment where those affected by his behavior felt trapped. They wanted change, but the positive public perception of him made it difficult to find allies or speak openly. During staff meetings, he began introducing changes that suited his own preferences. Rules were adjusted, deadlines were shifted, and resources were allocated selectively. Some staff members were clearly struggling under the new system, but he would justify the decisions as necessary for progress. It was not openly cruel, but the imbalance was evident. Team members began to feel demoralized, unsure if their efforts would ever be fairly recognized. The new team member documented these incidents carefully, knowing that if the pattern continued, it would need to be addressed publicly. At the same time, small acts of kindness and attention from him kept people confused. He would help a struggling colleague or acknowledge someone's hard work, making it harder to see the full scope of the problem. People were unsure whether his actions were intentional or if mistakes were just part of human error. This ambiguity allowed him to continue misusing his power without immediate consequences, but for those paying attention, it was clear that something needed to change. Tension began to grow between the team members. Some were frustrated, feeling they had no voice. Others tried to adapt, focusing only on the tasks at hand and avoiding confrontation. The new team member became a quiet leader, encouraging colleagues to observe and record incidents, to support one another, and to understand that speaking up was not wrong. She was careful, knowing that any misstep could lead to retaliation, but she also knew that silence would allow the misuse of power to continue. The man, sensing subtle resistance, became more strategic. He continued to show charm and fairness publicly, while carefully manipulating situations privately. If someone questioned him, he would respond with calm explanations that left them doubting their own perceptions. This tactic maintained control without creating direct conflict. He had learned that the appearance of fairness was as powerful as fairness itself, and he used it to maintain authority while pursuing his own interests. One particularly difficult Incident involved a team project where members had to present their ideas to an external panel. He took control of the presentation, altering the content to highlight his own contributions and downplay the work of others. Team members felt frustrated and powerless, but when they expressed concern, he smiled and reassured them that it was for the benefit of the project. Most accepted this explanation reluctantly, but the new team member quietly kept records and began to discuss concerns with a few trusted colleagues. Over time, small groups of staff members began sharing their experiences quietly. They exchanged stories of unfair treatment, overlooked contributions, and subtle manipulations. The man remained largely unaware of this quiet resistance, confident in his ability to maintain control. Yet, the foundation of opposition was forming, a slow but steady movement fueled by growing awareness and frustration. The contrast between his public image and private behavior was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. As the months passed, the misuse of power became more pronounced. Projects were increasingly designed to benefit him personally. Resources were allocated according to loyalty rather than need. Recognition was given selectively. Staff morale declined. But outwardly, he remained the picture of competence and charm. The new team member worked tirelessly behind the scenes, encouraging others to document experiences, support one another, and consider strategies for addressing the imbalance. She knew that confrontation would require careful planning, courage, and possibly external help. The environment at the center was now one of tension and quiet unease. People still admired the man's public persona, but those who worked closely with him felt the weight of his control. Some began avoiding meetings or taking on only what was necessary, while others quietly strategized about how to restore fairness. The new team member's presence offered hope and guidance, but the path forward was still uncertain. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, she stayed late to review notes and plan next steps. She reflected on the misuse of power she had witnessed and the impact it had on everyone. She realized that small acts of resistance and careful observation were the beginning of change. She also understood that if the situation continued unchecked, it could become worse. Her resolve strengthened. She would not allow fear or silence to dictate the future. Something had to be done, and she knew it would take patience, courage, and perhaps help from unexpected sources. The misuse of power at the center was no longer subtle. It affected daily life, morale, and the overall functioning of the organization. Yet the man continued to maintain his public image, confident and largely unchallenged. Those who noticed his actions quietly began preparing, observing, and supporting one another. The seeds of change were planted, small but powerful, waiting for the right moment. And though the challenges ahead seemed daunting, the determination of a few vigilant individuals promised that the story was far from over. The tension at the community center had been building for months. People were tired of the subtle manipulation and the unfairness, but most were unsure how to act. The new team member had been quietly gathering evidence and observing every decision, knowing that a direct confrontation without support could backfire. Then, an unexpected event changed everything. The center announced that 2 famous guests would visit for a community event. It was a rare opportunity, and everyone was excited. When the day arrived, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The presence of the celebrities brought energy and hope. People who had felt silenced or overlooked suddenly felt a spark of confidence. For many, it was the first time in months that they could breathe without tension. The man who had misused power was also excited. He saw this as an opportunity to shine publicly, to show how well he managed the center. He greeted the guests warmly, led tours, and gave speeches. On the surface, he seemed charming and competent, but those who had observed his behavior closely noticed that his actions were still calculated, and he remained focused on self-promotion. The new team member approached the visitors cautiously. She explained in simple words the challenges the team had been facing. She spoke about the unfairness, the selective recognition, and the manipulation that had been quietly affecting everyone. The celebrities listened carefully, showing genuine interest and concern. Their presence created an environment where the team felt safe to speak. They asked questions, showed empathy, and gave advice that was practical and encouraging. The man who misused power noticed that his control was being subtly challenged. For the first time, someone outside his inner circle was asking questions that mattered. He smiled and nodded, attempting to maintain his confident facade. But he felt the stirrings of unease. He realized that his actions, which had gone unnoticed for so long, could no longer hide behind charm alone. The presence of these respected figures brought scrutiny he had never experienced. During the event, the celebrities observed interactions closely. They noticed the small signs of stress and discomfort in the team, the subtle avoidance of eye contact and the hesitation to speak freely. They asked questions that encouraged honesty without confrontation. For the team, this was empowering. They began sharing their experiences in small, careful ways, explaining how certain decisions had caused frustration and demoralization. The new team member acted as a bridge, supporting her colleagues and expressing themselves clearly and safely. The man tried to maintain his composure. He continued to speak confidently and direct the activities, but he was more cautious than usual. The celebrity's attention made him aware that he could not act as freely as before. The subtle power he had wielded for months was now under observation, and he felt the first real pressure since his rise. People began to notice the difference in his demeanor. There was tension beneath the charm. After the event, the celebrity spoke privately with the team. They offered advice on communication, fairness, and standing up against misuse of power. Their words were practical, grounded, and inspiring. They encouraged the team to document issues, support one another, and speak up collectively when necessary. This guidance gave the team a new sense of purpose and courage. They began to see that change was possible with careful planning and support. The man realized that his influence was being challenged. He became strategic in response. He continued to charm and lead publicly, but he now observed the team's actions more closely. He tried to anticipate their moves, subtly undermining initiatives that could expose his actions. Yet the celebrity's presence had planted seeds of awareness and resistance that could not be erased. For the first time, he faced genuine scrutiny that he could not fully control. Meanwhile, the team members, guided by the new team member, began to act more boldly. They discussed patterns they had noticed, shared experiences, and encouraged each other to remain calm but observant. They documented incidents, gathered evidence, and developed plans for fair communication and reporting. The knowledge that outsiders had recognized the challenges gave them confidence they had never had before. Small confrontations began to occur. The man's decisions were questioned politely but firmly. He responded with his usual charm, but he now faced resistance he could not simply ignore. The new team member led these conversations, keeping them professional, respectful, and focused on fairness rather than personal attack. The team began to see that speaking up did not automatically result in retaliation, and that change was possible when done collectively and carefully. Over time, the influence of the celebrity's visit lingered. The team felt empowered to hold discussions that had previously been avoided. They began implementing small, fair adjustments in how tasks were assigned and how recognition was given. While the man still had control over many aspects, his unchecked authority was now limited by the awareness and courage of those around him. The balance of power was subtly shifting, and the seeds of accountability had taken root. The man tried to maintain his position of influence. He continued to appear competent and charming, but he became more cautious. He observed the team's actions and adjusted his strategies. While he still attempted to manipulate situations to his advantage, he could no longer ignore the growing awareness and resistance. The subtle power he had once held so freely was now challenged in ways he had not expected. The team, inspired by the support and attention they had received, began taking small, deliberate steps. They held meetings to discuss fairness, organized tasks more equitably, and recognized each other's contributions. They documented issues carefully, preparing for the possibility of addressing larger problems in the future. The environment began to improve, not because the man changed entirely, but because the team had found strength in unity, guidance, and courage. The new team member continued to play a central role. She encouraged collaboration, supported those who felt intimidated, and ensured that concerns were raised respectfully. Her careful planning, combined with the guidance and recognition from the celebrities, created a safe space for others to speak. The misuse of power was still present, but it was no longer invisible. People were learning that it could be addressed and that standing together made a difference. By the end of this period, the community center had shifted subtly. The man's control was still visible, but it was less absolute. Awareness, courage, and collective action had begun to balance his influence. The team felt empowered to speak up, and small improvements in fairness and morale were evident. While challenges remained, there was hope and a sense of possibility that had not existed before. The stage was set for further change, and the seeds of accountability had been planted through courage, guidance, and unexpected support. The shift in the community center was now undeniable. The team had grown more confident in observing and questioning the decisions of the man who had misused his power. They continued to document incidents and support one another, creating a quiet but growing sense of accountability. Yet the man still held considerable influence, and he had learned to mask his manipulations carefully. He could not openly defy the growing awareness without risk, so he adapted. His tactics became more subtle, focusing on persuasion, charm, and the appearance of fairness. One morning, the center hosted another event, this time a workshop led by the new team member and a few colleagues who had grown more courageous. They invited the celebrities back to participate, knowing their presence would provide a sense of security and authority. The man initially welcomed the idea, thinking it would enhance his image, but he soon realized that he could no longer dominate the situation entirely. The workshop emphasized collaboration, fair treatment, and recognition of everyone's contributions, principles that directly challenged his previous patterns. As the event progressed, the man tried to assert influence in his usual ways, making small decisions and commenting on projects. However, the team, emboldened by prior guidance and support, gently but firmly questioned him when necessary. They explained their reasoning, backed by observations and evidence from past incidents. The man felt the pressure but maintained a composed exterior. Internally, he was unsettled. He had underestimated the power of collective courage and outside validation. During a group discussion, one colleague brought up a specific incident where the man had taken credit for someone else's work. The atmosphere was tense, but the celebrities facilitated the conversation, emphasizing fairness and respect rather than confrontation. The man responded politely, offering explanations, but he could not dismiss the concern. He realized that the public and respected attention from these figures meant he could no longer control the narrative alone. For the first time, he felt the weight of accountability pressing on him. The team continued to address other examples, speaking one by one. They cited instances of unfair task distribution, selective recognition, and manipulations that had affected morale and productivity. Each story was presented calmly and respectfully, and the celebrities reinforced the importance of listening and acknowledging the impact of actions. The man had to face the collective evidence, and it was difficult for him to deny patterns that were so clearly documented and supported by witnesses. Despite the pressure, the man tried to regain control by emphasizing his past achievements and the successes he had led. He spoke of his intentions, painting himself as someone who acted for the community's benefit. The team listened but did not back down. They acknowledged his contributions but highlighted the need for fairness, accountability, and respect in leadership. The conversation shifted from personal blame to constructive feedback, making it difficult for him to respond defensively without seeming unreasonable. The celebrities encouraged solutions rather than punishment. They guided the team and the man to discuss ways to rebuild trust, improve communication, and ensure fairness moving forward. The man, though uncomfortable, recognized that ignoring these discussions was no longer an option. For the first time, he had to acknowledge not just isolated complaints but a consistent pattern of behavior that had negatively affected others. It was a humbling experience, one he had rarely encountered in his position of authority. After the workshop, the team met privately to reflect on what had happened. They discussed how effectively they had presented their concerns and how the man had responded. They felt a sense of accomplishment not because they had attacked him, but because they had stood together and spoken truthfully. The new team member encouraged everyone to continue documenting incidents and supporting one another. She emphasized that change would take time, but every step of accountability mattered. The man retreated briefly to reflect on the experience. He realized that his public image, though still largely positive, could no longer shield him from scrutiny. He felt conflicted, partly defensive, partly aware that he needed to adjust his behavior. The workshop had forced him to confront the consequences of his actions, and he could not ignore them. For the first time, he felt a tangible pressure to change, to consider fairness and transparency in ways he had previously avoided. In the following weeks, small but significant changes began to take place at the center. The man started including the team in decision-making processes more consistently. He consulted colleagues before implementing major changes and made efforts to recognize contributions more equitably. While some actions were motivated by a desire to maintain his public image, others reflected genuine attempts to address concerns. The team noticed improvements and responded with cautious optimism, understanding that lasting change required ongoing effort and vigilance. The new team member continued to play a vital role in this transformation. She facilitated discussions, encouraged open communication, and ensured that the voices of those previously overlooked were heard. Her leadership, combined with the presence of external authority figures like the celebrities, created a culture of accountability. The man's power was no longer unchecked. It was now balanced by transparency, collaboration, and collective awareness. Gradually, the community center began to function in a healthier way. Projects were managed more fairly, tasks were distributed equitably, and recognition was given where it was due. Team morale improved, and people felt empowered to contribute their ideas without fear of being dismissed or overshadowed. The man still held authority, but it was now exercised within a framework that respected fairness and accountability. The environment was no longer dominated by subtle manipulation, but guided by principles of respect and collaboration. The experience left a lasting impression on everyone involved. The man learned that charm and authority alone could not sustain leadership if fairness and accountability were neglected. The team learned that courage, unity, and careful planning could challenge misuse of power effectively. The new team member had demonstrated that persistence, documentation, and strategic action could lead to meaningful change, even in the face of entrenched authority. The presence of the celebrities had been more than symbolic. They had provided support, validation, and guidance that allowed the team to act confidently and constructively. Their influence had helped create an environment where accountability was possible, and fairness could be restored. The man's actions were no longer hidden, and the culture of the center had shifted toward transparency and mutual respect. The misuse of power had been confronted and transformed into an opportunity for learning and growth. By the end of this period, the balance at the center was remarkably different. The man, though still in a position of authority, was now accountable to the team and to the principles of fairness that had been reinforced by collective action and external guidance. The team felt empowered to maintain these standards, ensuring that future actions would be guided by collaboration and respect. The foundation for continued improvement had been laid, and the center was now on a path toward genuine, sustainable change. The story at this point was one of confrontation, reflection, and transformation. Misused power had been challenged openly and constructively, leading to a shift in culture and attitudes. The man's authority was no longer absolute, and the team had gained the confidence to maintain fairness and transparency. The stage was set for the final part of the story, where the consequences and lessons of these events would become fully clear, and the community center would move forward with a renewed sense of purpose and unity. In the final phase of the story, the community center had undergone significant changes. The misuse of power that had once gone unnoticed was now openly addressed, and the team felt empowered to maintain fairness and accountability. The man who had previously dominated every decision now faced the consequences of his actions. He had learned that leadership required more than authority and charm. It required respect, fairness, and transparency. The man began reflecting on his behavior more seriously. He recognized how his actions had affected morale, trust, and the overall environment. It was not an easy realization. Pride and habit made him defensive at times, but he also saw the genuine frustration and hurt he had caused. For the first time, he began to understand that leadership was about serving others, not controlling them. His reflection was personal and profound, and it set the stage for meaningful change. The team continued to support each other through this transformation. They shared experiences, celebrated small improvements, and reinforced a culture of fairness. Collaboration became a core part of every project. Decisions were made collectively whenever possible, and every team member's contribution was acknowledged. The new team member had helped build a sense of unity that allowed everyone to feel valued and empowered. Over time, the man began to adjust his behavior in practical ways. He involved the team in planning meetings, asked for feedback on important decisions, and made an effort to recognize contributions accurately. At first, some colleagues were skeptical, unsure if his changes were genuine or motivated by self-interest. However, as he consistently demonstrated fairness and accountability, trust gradually returned. People began to feel safe expressing ideas and concerns, and the center's environment improved significantly. The celebrities who had previously visited continued to be a source of inspiration, even if they were no longer physically present. Their influence had encouraged the team to act confidently and provided guidance that was internalized. The new team member used their lessons on fairness, accountability, and courage to lead ongoing initiatives. She ensured that the changes were not temporary, but embedded into the center's culture. Regular discussions, transparent decision-making, and mutual support became the new norm. The community center thrived as a result. Projects ran smoothly, morale was high, and people felt heard and respected. The atmosphere was no longer dominated by fear or manipulation, but by collaboration and shared responsibility. The man, now aware of his previous misuse of power, embraced a more balanced approach. He still held authority, but it was exercised in a way that aligned with fairness and transparency, reinforcing trust among his colleagues. Some challenges still arose, as is natural in any organization. Old habits sometimes resurfaced, and not every decision was perfect. However, the team had developed the tools to address these challenges constructively. Open communication, collective problem-solving, and careful observation ensured that any issues were handled promptly and fairly. The environment had shifted from one of control and fear to one of accountability, respect, and shared purpose. The man's journey was particularly striking. He moved from a position of unchecked power to one of responsible leadership. The experience taught him humility, patience, and the importance of listening. While it had been uncomfortable to face his actions and accept accountability, the outcome improved not only the organization, but also his own understanding of leadership. He had gained a deeper respect for the people around him and the value of their contributions. The new team member emerged as a quiet hero throughout this process. Her careful observation, courage, and commitment to fairness helped catalyze change. She empowered others to speak up, guided discussions constructively, and ensured that improvements were sustainable. Her leadership showed that persistence and thoughtful action could challenge misuse of power effectively, even in the face of long-standing authority. The broader community benefited as well. People attending the center noticed the change in atmosphere. Events were better organized, projects ran more efficiently, and participants felt welcomed and valued. The ripple effect of the team's collective courage and accountability extended beyond the organization itself. The center became a model of fairness, collaboration, and respect. The final lesson of this story was clear. Power, when misused, can harm people and organizations, but it can also be corrected when courage, awareness, and collective action are applied. The man had misused his authority, but through confrontation, reflection, and guidance, he learned to wield it responsibly. The team learned that standing together and documenting concerns could lead to meaningful change. The new team member demonstrated that careful planning, empathy, and persistence could transform even challenging situations. In the end, the community center was stronger than before. Leadership was no longer a tool for control, but a framework for collaboration and fairness. The man who once relied on charm and authority alone had become a more balanced and self-aware leader. The team had learned the importance of vigilance, unity, and speaking up for fairness. The environment was now one of mutual respect, trust, and shared purpose, a place where everyone could contribute confidently and effectively. The story closed with a sense of hope and achievement. Misused power had been confronted, accountability had been established, and lessons had been learned.